Hello, and this is the first podcast of the immune system unit. And in this one, we're going to be learning about the first and second lines of defense against diseases. And in the next podcast, we'll be learning about the third line of defense against diseases. And basically, we're going to learn about how our body protects us from pathogens in a non-specific way. That means that the defense will work for a variety of different germs. In the third line of defense, it's specific against, it'll work against one but not the other. Here's some vocabulary, and this is not exhaustive for this particular podcast. This is just some vocabulary we need to know at the very beginning. First is a vocab word that we've had before, and it's a very important one in this and several other units, and that's homeostasis, and that is keeping the body stable. The disease is simply a disruption of homeostasis. So when your body loses its stability, then you come down with disease. And a pathogen is an organism that causes a disease. And you'll find out that quite a few diseases are actually not caused by pathogens. We're going to briefly go over different types of diseases, and only one of them actually we're going to be covering in this unit. First one is disease that's caused by an injury, and this is a picture of showing people who have an injury from a disease, and that's Christopher Reeve, who played Superman, and he broke his neck in a riding accident and became paralyzed. Another one is cardiovascular disease, and there are several of these different types, and the one I have in the diagram shows the symptoms of a stroke, which is basically when there's either a blood clot or there's a burst blood vessel inside the brain, and from that parts of the brain cannot get adequate oxygen from the blood, and they start dying, and that causes a whole variety of problems. And a lot of cardiovascular disease are preventable through both diet and fitness. Tricky thing with this is that some of the cardiovascular diseases, there basically are no symptoms. You feel perfectly healthy until the bigger stuff hits. Then we have genetic diseases. This particular genetic disease is called polydactyly, and that's where you've got more than 10 fingers. For those of you who remember dominant and recessive genes from junior high, this particular gene is actually dominant. Most people, you wouldn't see this because most people actually would have the 11th finger surgically removed while an infant. Then we have non-genetic birth defects. This particular birth defect you see here is caused by thalidomide. Back in the 1950s, they were giving the drug thalidomide to pregnant women to help them with the symptoms of morning sickness. They found out that it actually caused birth defects like what you see here. It was a disaster. Thousands and thousands of people ended up with these birth defects. Just imagine what a mother is going through when she's pregnant and finds out that her child may end up with this birth defect, and it's just tough. Then there's cancer, and cancer is where one of your own body cells just loses it. You lose control over it, and that body cell starts reproducing without anything stopping it. So it basically just crowds everything out and is able to move to different parts of the body also, and it's able to survive and crowd out there. And it crushes the organs, and that's eventually what causes death. And then we come to the one that we're going to be covering in this unit, and those are infectious diseases, and those are caused by a pathogen. Now, there's several different types of pathogens. One of those is a virus, and interesting thing about a virus that we learned about in the cell unit is that viruses is a question as to whether it's actually alive, in that it, first of all, it's not made of a cell. That you see, you have a protein coat, and inside the protein coat, there's either DNA or RNA. Usually, it's DNA. The one on the left is a virus that infects a bacteria, and the one on the right is HIV, which is the AIDS virus. And HIV is unusual in that instead of having DNA as its for holding its genetic component, it has RNA. And what the viruses do is they infect the cell, they take over the cell, and they force the cell to make thousands and thousands of copies of the virus. Basically turns the cell that infects into a virus factory. Then we have bacteria. The bacteria that we see here, this is the bacteria that causes the disease syphilis. Bacteria are cells. They're different from ours in that they are prokaryotic, ours are eukaryotic. And prokaryotic cells lack most of the organelles. In particular, they lack the nucleus, but they still have DNA. They're just free-floating in the cytoplasm. Then there are some animals that are pathogens, like we have some worms. The worm pictured here is a tapeworm. There also are single-celled organisms that are not bacteria, or eukaryotes like us. They have a nucleus, and some of them can cause diseases. This particular one pictured here is called Plasmodium. It's the protozoa that causes malaria. Now we come to how we defend ourselves from these pathogens. The first line of defense is just simply to keep the pathogens out of the body. Mostly it's barriers to keep it out. The skin is one of the barriers that protects us from pathogens, and it's a very effective barrier. One thing, the epidermis is made of dead cells, and those are sealed together so things can't get in between them. And a lot of pathogens, like say a virus, which has to take over a cell, a virus cannot take over a cell that's dead, so it's a very, very effective barrier. Another part of the barrier is that the sweat contains acids, and the acids will have, since they have a low pH, that will denature a lot of the proteins that are in the pathogens. And also it contains an enzyme called lysozyme. And what that does is it destroys the cell wall of the bacteria. Cell walls of bacteria are different from in the plants. In plants, the cell walls are made of cellulose, and they are mainly support the plant. It's like the skeleton of the plant. In bacteria, the cell walls are protective. So by destroying the cell wall, it makes the bacteria very vulnerable. Main way that pathogens are able to get through the skin is if you have something like a cut. The stomach forms another barrier because pathogens are able to get into us through all different areas where the skin isn't, like for example our mouth. The stomach contains acid, and it's one of the most acidic parts of our body, or in the stomach acid is one of the most acidic things there are. It's a pH of about 2, and the lowest pH is 1, neutral is 7. And it gets to around 2 during meals. Most pathogens die instantly when they hit that, though some are able to survive the acid. In some cases, it will make things worse than what it could have been otherwise, because the acid can turn the toxin that's in the bacteria that causes botulism. It turns that toxin to become very, very deadly. By the way, if you want to avoid botulism, then when you see any cans, make sure that you don't use any cans that are dented or bloated, or when you open them, they start squirting out. Another possibility where bacteria or other pathogens can get into our body or through the nose, and we have nose hairs that filter the hair. Now, if things get past that, they can get into trachea or windpipe, and there we have 2 types of defenses in there. First thing is that mucus is able to trap the pathogens, and once that happens, the cilia sweeps them to the nose, or where we will blow our nose and get rid of it, or it goes to our mouth where we swallow it. Now, cilia are actually organelles. In most organisms, like single-celled organisms, the cilia act like a team of oarsmen, and they move the cell throughout the water. In us, like in our trachea, what it does is it moves the mucus around and keeps us from choking. One area where we don't have the cilia is our voice box. Sometimes the mucus gets trapped there, and we have to cough to move it. One reason why smokers tend to cough a lot is because the heat from the cigarette smoke will basically destroy all the cilia. Some other possible places where pathogens might enter our body, and are things like the vagina, the large intestine, and eyes. The defenses we have there are that in the vagina, acid kills the pathogens, and also there's a lot of mucus there, and the mucus acts like a barrier too. In the large intestine, we actually have lots and lots of bacteria, but the bacteria there are not pathogens. They give us vitamin K, and they also help us in that they outcompete the pathogens that could get in there. Our eyes also contain lysozyme, which, remember, is that enzyme that destroys bacterial cell walls. Okay, so now that brings us to the second line of defense. This happens once the first line of defense is breached. So now a pathogen has gotten into our body. Now we have to basically kill it before it kills us. Its second line is different from the third line, which you'll learn about next in the next podcast, in that it's a non-specific attack. And by non-specific, that means that the cells involved in this attack and the chemicals that are used in this attack are general. They can be used against a variety of different pathogens. In the third line defense, we'll see there we have a specific attack where the things are basically specialized. The things will attack only a specific pathogen, and they won't and everything else they'll leave alone. The cells of the immune system are generally called white blood cells. And we'll find the white blood cells in the second line of defense, which we're learning about now, and the third line of defense also. What we have pictured here is a macrophage, also sometimes called a phagocyte, and also neutrophils do the same thing. They will eat the pathogens by a process called phagocytosis. That's what you're seeing here, where it literally will engulf the bacteria, and the bacteria are the pink rod-like things you see there, and they eat them. And they will literally chase them down and hunt them, as you'll see in this video. Another way that things get attacked is like what happens when the virus is actually, or bacteria, has entered the cell and has not just infected our body, but it's infected the cells. The macrophages won't be able to attack those. What we have is another type of white blood cell called natural killer cells. And what they do is they kill the pathogens by killing the infected cells. And basically what they do is they use an enzyme to punch holes in the cell membrane, and that basically causes the cell to lysis, or sort of like explode. And inflammation is another way that we use to protect ourselves. These are actually symptoms that we feel. Here's a video that shows us what inflammation is and how it works.
We are equipped with many effective means for blocking potential pathogens from entering the body, including the skin and the mucous membranes as physical barriers. Furthermore, enzymes such as lysozyme can be found in tears and sweat and are capable of destroying many would-be invaders chemically. However, despite these significant external barriers to infection, an occasional pathogen may make it inside our body. Upon infection, the body sets into action with the inflammatory response. This response is nonspecific, attacking any and all foreign invaders. And if you've ever had an infected cut, you've seen it in action. Think for a moment about what signs you associate with infection in a cut. Perhaps you thought of redness, swelling, and pus. These are symptoms that the inflammatory response can help to explain. Upon injury, invading pathogens such as bacteria and viruses have a means to enter the body. Luckily, the injured cells immediately begin to release distress signals. Damaged mast cells in the connective tissue release histamine. This influx of histamine to the site of injury immediately begins to change the behavior of blood vessels in the region. Arterioles open while venules narrow, resulting in increased blood flow. This new pattern of blood flow can explain the redness and heat associated with infection. Furthermore, the capillaries within the injured tissue will begin to dilate and become leaky. While it may seem that leaky blood vessels are the last thing you want in an injured tissue, they are in fact crucial to an effective inflammatory response. To understand why, consider for a moment the components of blood that would be helpful if they could make their way to the site of injury and infection. Foremost on your list is likely to be platelets and their associated clotting factors. Indeed, both platelets and clotting factors will exit through the leaky capillary walls and migrate towards the site of injury. These elements serve a dual purpose. Not only do they help to heal the wound and seal damaged blood vessels, but they also confine infectious agents to the wound site, slowing their spread throughout the body. Meanwhile, a second line of defense is on the way. Cells near the injury release a series of chemical signals which radiate from the site of inflammation. The signals are known as chemokines, and their concentration is greatest in the area immediately surrounding the infection. The gradient of chemokine concentration provides an important roadmap for phagocytotic white blood cells, including neutrophils, as they make their way onto the scene. Following ever-increasing chemokine concentrations, phagocytes exit the leaky capillaries and enter the site of infection. Here, they go to work engulfing and destroying the pathogens present. With the infection taken care of, the wound site begins to heal. After they engulf pathogen particles and eventually die, these white blood cells eventually make up the pus that we associate with infected cuts and scrapes. Finally, with pathogen particles destroyed and damaged tissue repaired, histamine signals begin to fade, and blood vessels return to their normal size. The inflammatory response has successfully dealt with a pathogenic breach of our body's outer defenses.
Here are the concluding questions. Number 1, define disease. Number 2, define pathogen. Number 3, list 2 ways we keep pathogens out of our body. This is the first line of defense. Number 4, how do white blood cells kill pathogens? Number 5, what are the symptoms of the inflammatory response? And number 6, how do these symptoms help maintain homeostasis? That concludes this podcast. See you tomorrow in class.